Hello, everyone out there in Zoomland. My name is Steve Swain, talking to you from Quechee, Vermont, where Hurricane Isaias or Tropical Storm Isaias has just reached us. If there is a power outage, we'll come back with some more news, but right now everything is stable. So we're so glad to see the almost 100 of you who have joined us for this broadcast and live question and answer as a part of Conversations with Phil Klay, Montgomery Fellows Program 2020 Summer Fellow, our 257th Fellow of the Montgomery Fellows Program. The conversation itself is pre-recorded, but the question and answer is going to be live. As the conversation goes on, you'll notice within your own Zoom window, there is a Q&A section below on the right side of the bottom. Feel free as the conversation is going on to populate the Q&A with your questions as you hear what Phil and Jim are having to say to one another. And we will get back to that. The conversation will last about till 7 o'clock, and then we'll have the live Q&A for approximately 15 minutes. We're aiming to finish around 7:15 to 7:20. Again, welcome to this conversation between Phil Klay and Jim Wright, talking about American culture and military culture. And in order to introduce them, who they are, I've asked the provost of Dartmouth College, Joe Helbley, to provide that introduction.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for joining us. We are gathering during an exceptional period for higher education for Dartmouth and for the Montgomery Fellows Program. We're faced with a pandemic that has altered most aspects of our daily lives. But Dartmouth is resilient, and I have never been so impressed with our community as we constantly find ways to adapt, to enrich, and to connect in meaningful and new ways. Finding a way to engage our community through the Montgomery Fellows Program in these extraordinary times, thanks to the vision of Director Steve Swain, is a perfect example, and it's why I'm proud to be introducing the first ever virtual Montgomery Fellow residency. We welcome Phil Klay as this summer's Montgomery Fellows Program Resident Fellow and thank him for being willing to participate in this experiment, this first ever virtual MFP residency. Phil is a member of the Dartmouth class of 2005, graduating just a few months before I joined the Dartmouth community, and a veteran of the U.S. Marine Corps. He served in Iraq's Anbar province from January 2007 to February 2008 as a public affairs officer, and after being discharged, he received an MFA from Hunter College of the City University of New York. Phil Klay's New York Times bestselling short story collection, Redeployment, won the National Book Award for Fiction in 2014, and Phil's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, and the Brookings Institution's Brookings Essay Series. Joining Phil for this extraordinary conversation is James Wright, a fellow Marine veteran and the President Emeritus of Dartmouth College. Jim first joined Dartmouth as a member of the History Department in 1969 and served ultimately as the Dean of the Faculty, the Provost, and our 16th President during his 40 years at the college. In fact, Jim is the president who hired me back in 2005 to be the Dean of the Thayer School of Engineering. And so I cannot introduce Jim without offering a personal anecdote that to me speaks so strongly of who he is as a leader and who he is as a person. From my very first meeting with Jim Wright, the interview in his office in which he extended the offer to me to join the Dartmouth administration, I remember a piece of galena ore that he kept on his desk as president. I was immediately curious, as a chemical engineer who had done some work with mineral matter, as to why he had a piece of ore on his desk, and he very calmly explained that it was a reminder of his roots, of his days working in zinc mines in Illinois and Wisconsin as a young man, as a way to never forget where he had come from and how education had profoundly shaped and altered his life. Jim would be true to his roots, returning to his roots in the military to make trips to visit wounded soldiers at the Walter Reed Army Medical Center. In his unassuming way, he would slowly encourage them to consider continuing their education at the country's most competitive academic institutions, subtly planting seeds of Dartmouth for some of them, and knowing that we at Dartmouth would benefit even more than they by their presence on our campus. Watching those actions and what they did for this community made me extraordinarily proud to work at an institution that Jim Wright led. It is my pleasure to introduce this conversation between these two men who have had extraordinary careers since their time in the military. Enjoy the discussion between the two of them as they engage in a wide-ranging conversation, which will be followed by a time of question and answer. Without further ado, the floor belongs to Phil Klay and Jim Wright.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that really wonderful and kind introduction. And thanks to Dartmouth and the Dartmouth community for coming with me on this virtual residency. And especially thank you to President Wright. Really thrilling to be able to talk to you, especially because you were my president when I was at Dartmouth. I think one of my wife and I, she's a 06, our favorite stories from that time about you is a friend of my wife's was getting off the Dartmouth coach, and she had just like tons of heavy bags, like an absurd amount of heavy bags. She steps off the coach, is looking at this pile of stuff, then sees you across the green and goes, "Hey, President Wright." And the next thing anybody knows, you're helping her lug all of her luggage back to her dorm room, which made sense to me when I found out about your Marine past. It's a large part of being a Marine is lugging heavy things far distances. So the trip across the green wasn't so bad.
I'm pleased to be here with you, Phil, and it's just we've been so honored, I think, by all that you've done. You're just such an exceptional writer. I've always enjoyed Redeployment, and you're a tremendous nonfiction writer as well. I really admire some of what you've written. Now, I do remember your commissioning in the Marine Corps on, I think, June 11th, 2005 in Rawlins.
You were there.
I came there for the commissioning ceremony. There were 3 of you, and you had 1,000 classmates. What led you to the Marine Corps in 2005?
Sure. I think if you'd asked me in high school if I was going to join the Marine Corps, I never would have thought that the answer would have been yes. But I had been raised to take the idea of service very, very seriously. My father had been in the Peace Corps. My mother spent a large part of her career in international medical aid. My grandfather was a career diplomat. And so, I was always, and also, I went to a Jesuit school where we were told we had an obligation to be men for others. So the idea of service, of doing something to be of service to my country was important to me. And I went to Dartmouth. I started at Dartmouth in September of 2001. And I was actually on the Appalachian Trail at the Dimensions of Dartmouth trip. When 9/11 happened, we got the news from other hikers who we at first thought were pulling our leg, telling us some absurd story about what had happened in Manhattan. And so very soon, America was in one war, and then it was gearing up for another. And it seemed to me that this was the big thing that my country was doing, that the way to insert myself into this and to try and be of service was to join the military. The Marines have the best uniforms. One of my older brothers had joined the Marine Corps. I was attracted by the rigor of it, the military ethos, just a lot of things that were appealing to me about the idea of joining the Marines. And so that was why I joined. What led you into the Corps?
Well, I was that age in an altogether different era. I joined in 1957. I was 17. I hadn't yet turned 18, just out of high school. And 4 friends and I joined the Marine Corps. We had 25 boys in my high school graduating class, and 5 of us joined the Marines. Another half dozen joined other branches of service. And it was a time when going into the service, as it was described, was a part of life. My dad had served in World War II. Almost everyone I knew had a father or older brother who had served during the war. I had, like you, gone to Catholic schools, and I was have been taught to be careful of communism, although I don't think that anything ideological came into my thinking. And I just wanted to join the Marines because the Marines were considered, back in my hometown, this old mining town, the branch of service that you should join. And I went in at an interesting time. Nobody ever fired a shot at me, and I was never asked to fire a shot at anyone else. But I managed to move from my small mining town and see a good bit of the world. And more importantly, perhaps, I decided to go to college. I hadn't thought about going to school before that. Nobody in my family had. But when I got out of the Marines, I was 20, nearly 21 years old. I thought, maybe I'll try this. And I haven't stopped going to school since then. I'm still learning.
You're a historian. So, as you look at the present moment, and you see the ways in which the sort of iconography of the military is being used, is this an issue that you're particularly concerned about? How do you feel we stand relative to other periods?
Yeah, I am concerned about it. 60% of the men my age are veterans. Something like, 2% of your age are veterans. And it's clear which way those demographics are going to flow. And I'm not sure what this means, but I find it troubling. I do think that having more people who served in the military demystifies the military. And yet I'm not suggesting that we suddenly ask another several million kids a year to join the military. That's not, but people don't understand it. And I think it's becoming something that's even more mystifying to the American public. My generation understood those who served as those who went into battle, moved from Normandy to Paris, or moved to clear the island of Iwo Jima or Okinawa. And warfare is different today. I think there's too much of a sense of it being drones and a video game war. There's no great stories of places that have been occupied and a flag raising on top of a hill. Those days are over. So we thank you for your service. But as one Vietnam veteran said to me, people thanking me for my service now, 40, 50 years later, is almost like after I sneeze, they say, God bless you. They no more intend God to bless me for sneezing than they really want to thank you for your service. And I don't think we know what it is that you do or what it is that you've done. I visited Vietnam when I wrote my book about the Vietnam War. And I didn't quite think about it until afterwards, after I'd written the book. But I wanted to visit, I was visiting sites where battles have been fought of kids that I was writing about. And there were 4 places I visited in a single day in an area the Marines call Dodge City, southwest of Da Nang, where 4 people I was interested in were killed. A number more were killed in the same battles. I realized 2 of them were Dartmouth men, by the way, Duncan Slay and Billy Smoyer. But I realized later that these 4 men were killed, these 4 Marines were killed about 10 months apart in an area that was roughly 15 square miles. And their war in Vietnam was much like the war that you experienced in Iraq. You send out patrols day after day, you're not occupying a place, and you're basically encouraging the enemy to assault you so that you can hit back with greater firepower. There's 60% of the medals of honor awarded in World War II were awarded to people who were involved in offensive operations. I think in your war, it's maybe a handful. Medals of honor are awarded for defensive activities, often for putting your life at risk, perhaps losing your life to save somebody that you're with. It's a different type of warfare. So we don't understand it. We thank you for your service. You come home. When during the Vietnam War in the 70s, about 75 or 80% of the members of Congress had served in the military. Today, I think it's about 18%. And I think it's important to have a military voice there, not just as a saber rattler. We don't need more saber rattlers, and not sort of as looking after the VA conditions of employment, although we do need more of that. But it's more to have that voice and that experience. When we talk about the world around us, it's best to know what's involved. It's best to know that putting, quote, boots on the ground is not some metaphor for a bunch of dancing booties out there. It's we're asking our sons and daughters to go, and some of them will not come back. And I think we have to understand that better. Your writing has helped us to do that, and I really applaud you for it.
Thank you. You know, one of the things about veterans in Congress, I think there's 96, somewhere around there.
Yes, that's right.
So veterans in Congress tend to, their party affiliation is more likely to tell you what they're going to vote on than the fact that they served overseas. But one thing that I have seen, sort of some bipartisan work on from veterans across the aisle is on things like the authorization of military force. Because you mentioned the fact that we don't understand the war that we're fighting. And partly, I think that's because the nature of the wars that we're fighting are, as you said, very complicated and difficult to understand. They're murky. They involve training up local forces in other countries and supporting them and doing sort of kill capture raids. I mean, doing kill capture raids tends to be the most popular thing that we do in terms of pop culture. We love hearing stories of Navy SEALs going on raids. The relationship of, a bunch of highly trained commandos killing somebody in a country and sort of broader strategic goals is, I think, not just extremely murky to the American public, it's often extremely murky to the veterans themselves. So that's partly, I think, why it's so difficult. I think the other part is frankly by design, right? So, in Iraq, initially, sort of President Obama had been elected with a mandate to pull back from Iraq, and he did that. But then during the rise of ISIS, began introducing troops again. Wasn't a politically popular thing to do, or something that he wanted to expend much political capital on. You mentioned the phrase boots on the ground. They were sort of slowly increasing the number of special operators while claiming that they weren't boots on the ground. Vets that I know started joking that special operators must wear slippers. Combat slippers. They would sort of do these tap dances where a special operator would end up in a combat situation, but they would say they weren't, we're not sending troops into combat, just troops sometimes end up in combat situations. There was frankly a lot of BS, a lot of lying. I saw that happen personally. I remember being in an event where Susan Rice introduced me and a couple of the folks, and it was an audience with a lot of active duty military, generals, admirals, and about a dozen severely injured troops, guys whose faces had been burned severely, guys who were missing limbs. And she said, this is in 2015, in the middle of her introduction, one of our proudest accomplishments in the Obama administration is ending the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And somebody in the audience went, right? And it wasn't clear to me in the audience whether she was lying to us or lying to herself. And so I think that that sort of thing where the mood of the American public seems to be that they don't want to commit to the wars because they think they're a disaster, right? But at the same time, they don't like it when we withdraw from a place and things go haywire, which is what tends to happen. I was in Iraq in December, and I met with some Syrian refugees in northern Iraq who had to flee after the sort of semi-pullout that President Trump sort of impulsively did and then walked back on. And I remember sitting in a UN tent with a man with several pins in his leg, his pregnant wife, his 2 children, Syrian Kurd, who was just, livid about the fact that the Kurds had fought with the United States, helping the United States in their mission, and then they were abandoned. And so, people don't like that. And there's good reasons not to like that, but they don't like the wars either. And so what we slowly have seemed to have settled on is a situation where we're not debating the wars. We have the same authorization of military force that we've always had. So there's not any, there's no political necessity for a member of Congress to actually debate our policy, debate whether we're achieving strategic goals, debate whether there even are strategic goals that are being coherently pursued, and then whether we're resourcing the mission adequately, and then vote on it. We don't do that anymore. And no member of Congress wants that responsibility, who wants to be sort of, Hillary Clinton having made a vote that was popular at the time, but unpopular later. And so instead we have a lot of emphasis on special operations troops, on drones, on things that can sort of be done on the cheap. We have special operations troops and special forces that are, run incredibly thin. Several years ago, Assistant Secretary in the Department of Defense said that in order to maintain the pace of operations, the special operations community has had to mortgage its future and eat our young. And so there's kind of a steady state of these missions which require the least expenditure of political capital humanly possible, which I frankly don't think is an acceptable way to run military policy. In that regard, there's actually, despite the stylistic differences which are extreme between the current president and the last one, President Trump's policy is in some ways a continuation of the Obama policy in that regard. I remember one of the previous times that we saw each other, President Wright, was at the Intrepid during the 2016 presidential campaign, when I had the opportunity to ask then candidate Trump a question.
Mr. Trump, over the past 15 years, a lot of U.S. troops have bled and died, securing towns and provinces from Iraq to Afghanistan, only to have insurgent groups like ISIS spring back the moment we leave. Now, you've claimed to have a secret plan to defeat ISIS, but you're hardly the first politician to promise a quick victory and a speedy homecoming. So, assuming we do defeat ISIS, what next? What is your plan for the region to ensure that a group like them doesn't just come back?
And he gave a sort of long, rambling answer where he said that we should have taken the oil, which was not the best answer, I would say, to put it mildly. And so my expectation was, okay, so things are going to continue without real leadership, right? And you have a highly professional military, so a lot of the individual actions are going to be done very well. But there's going to be no overarching strategy to justify or make sense of the expenditure of human lives and capital. And I think that's part of why it's so confusing, why it's so difficult when civilians try to engage with the wars to even know where to begin. I think it's not just the difficulty of the wars, but I think it's the failure of our political leadership.
Yes, and it's also trying to understand the purpose of a war before it begins. And I don't think, let's face it, things are not as crisp today as they were during World War II. And so I'm not suggesting we've got to engage in trying to find a similar purpose. But I recall writing an op-ed, it must have been in 2013, a number of years ago. It was on the 10th year anniversary of President George W. Bush landing on the Abraham Lincoln with the big mission accomplished banner behind him on the ship, which proved to be some embarrassment to him and to others. And I said that ironically, in military terms, the mission was accomplished by then. It's just that nobody knew what to do with it. Nobody had really thought what to do with it. And I do remember being at that forum with you in 2016, and you're asking candidate Trump that question, and he didn't want to reveal what he would do next. He said that you can't negotiate if the other side knows what you want to do, which is not unlike Richard Nixon never really said he had a secret plan in 1968 to end the war in Vietnam, but people around him that did, and he was very careful not to suggest what he was going to do to end the war in Vietnam. But secret plans are troubling, and acknowledging that when you're in negotiations, you can't tip off all of your endpoints and your bottom lines. But I think secret plans are bad in a democracy. What are we trying to do? What if we'd sent troops to Syria, to what end? What do we want to accomplish there? And I think that's what we've been dealing with in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think that you wrote something a year or so ago about immigration, maybe in the last year, about the people who've supported American troops and are left behind in these places. And I think that was part of the concern when President Trump said, let's pull out of Syria. I'm not sure that most people would have disputed pulling out of Syria, but we've got a lot of friends who put their lives on the line for us there. What are we going to do about it? And I think it comes back to the absence of a plan. And I'm not sure anyone has had a good plan for the last 16, 18 years. We knew kind of what we wanted to do in Afghanistan, but that was accomplished within a matter of several weeks. And then we didn't quite know what to do next. And we're still there trying to determine what to do next.
It seems that, discussion about the wars is not really impacting the public conversation the way, sort of, to my mind, very disturbing turn that discussion about our military has taken is in the recent months, and particularly during the protests, there's been a kind of continual attempt to enlist, I think, the military in culture war or in sort of a particular type of discomfort with the protests that you see from the right. So, there was during the, sometimes it reaches almost comical extremes. I remember the White House press secretary saying that we can't change the name of military bases that have been named after Confederate generals because it would somehow be an insult to the troops who died, who left from those bases. As a buddy of mine, Matt Gallagher, I think, responded to that aptly on Twitter. He said, if the last thoughts of any of my dead friends was of the freaking base that they left from, I'll eat Kevlar. Or in sort of a more sinister register, I think something like what happened with Lafayette Square, where you have peaceful protesters who are tear gassed. You've got the National Guard there. You have General Milley in, battle dress as if he's walking out onto a battlefield. Something that he later apologized for, because I think sort of within the institution of the military, I think there's a real sense of the extreme danger of American troops being enlisted in against protesters, right? And in what is ultimately a domestic political dispute. But it is something that I watch with a certain degree of real concern about how that's happening.
How do you write about war? And I know you have written a piece on that I found very, very good and very, very interesting. And let me preface that a bit. My book on the Vietnam War is really about the grunts on the ground, the Marines, the soldiers, the paratroopers on the ground, and what the combat experience was like in Vietnam. And this is just a smaller percentage of those who actually served there. I interviewed about 160 people for this. I read everything I could get my hands on. I was always aware of the fact that here I was writing about an experience, and people could say to me, "Wait a minute, you've not been there. You can't write about that unless you've been there." And I think you wrote about the participants, the troops on the ground, as well as the poets who try to tell the story of war. And I do think having some personal knowledge, if not experience, is absolutely crucial. But what would you say about that? Do you have to have been a grunt on the ground to be able to write about that ground?
No, I certainly hope not, but I don't write about my own personal experiences in fiction. And there are plenty of great war novels where that's the case. There's a very funny scene in Vasily Grossman's, either in Stalingrad or Life and Fate, where there's this general who's talking about war and peace, and he's like, Tolstoy knew because he was there, and Vasily Grossman is trying to explain to him that Tolstoy was not actually in the Napoleonic Wars, and the guy just refuses to believe. And of course, famously, Civil War veterans couldn't believe that Stephen Crane had not been in the Civil War. I think that there's a sort of odd way in which, and it really becomes present in the 20th century and 20th century literature, this idea that war is somehow incommunicable, right? And sort of only those who have been to war can talk about it. Only those who, have seen the beast know what it really is. And it sounds in some ways like a compliment you're paying to veterans, right? But what you are actually doing is sort of putting them in a box and saying that this sort of vital thing that you experience is forever incommunicable. You will always be alone, right? I remember my friend Elliot Ackerman, who served multiple deployments, is a Silver Star, is a wonderful fiction writer as well, talking about how if you say you can't understand what I've been through, that means my children will never understand me. That means I can never come home, and so I need you to try to understand what I've been through so I can come home, right? I don't think that just because you've been through an experience, you're the ultimate arbiter of what that experience means. I think that especially when you're dealing with intense and terrifying and confusing experiences that are central to who you are, and that you have pride and that provoke love and fear and rage, and all the other strong emotions that come with anything intense, whether it's war or not, it's difficult to know what that means. You don't experience it and then understand it, because the experience is as multi-layered as anything. What you do is, over time, you sort of come to an understanding of who you are in relationship to that. And how do you come to that understanding? You come to that through oftentimes talking it over with other people, getting other perspectives, finding points of commonality. I remember being in a conversation with a woman who had read a piece. I think the first piece that I wrote for the New York Times was about this experience of watching a Marine die in a military hospital and having a sort of sense of shocked numbness, right? And shocked numbness was something that she understood well, because she was a victim of childhood abuse, right? And so she starts telling me about how I had described feelings that she felt she understood. And then in the middle of the conversation said, not that I'm, comparing what I've been through to what you've been through. I could never imagine what you've been through. Well, I was a public affairs officer. My deployment was not that hard. She was talking about things that had happened to her as a child that were horrible, right? And yet she didn't say, you can't understand me. She said, you wrote a thing that made me feel something resonant, that there was something that we could actually communicate about regarding an experience that is deeply difficult and painful to talk about. And that is the beauty of writing and art. And that is, one of the most profound things that it is capable of serving as a bridge between two people. If I didn't think if I didn't think the experience could be communicated, I wouldn't write. And if the experience can be communicated, that means that other people can write about it and think about it in productive ways that that might not occur to me because I'm inside the experience, right? I mean, I think one of the best novels written about Iraq is Ben Fountain's Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. He didn't serve. He did his homework, right? He didn't just you know, regurgitate stereotypes on the page. He learned about the military. He thought very deeply about it, and he created real, vivid characters who are expressing something true about the experience, especially the experience of homecoming. So that is something that I very much reject. I also, part of the reason that I reject it is because, you know, you mentioned this, you know, so few people serve, right? And I don't want, in a democracy, there to be some sort of idea that only vets can talk about war. Because if only vets can talk about war, then there's not a lot of people who are going to be talking about war. And we need to be discussing it more. This is an issue of vital importance. If you are an American citizen, you have a lot to do with these wars, because war is a lot of what we do as a country. And it is not good enough to say, I'm going to listen to the vets. No, I want you thinking critically about the wars. I want you thinking critically about what vets are telling you. I want you engaging. I want you telling me when I'm full of BS, right? And other vets when they're full of BS. Because trust me, veterans are as full of BS as the rest of the American public, right? And we are a country that is very good at BSing, which is why we need to be able to have rich, critical conversations, not pretend that because I was in the military 10 years ago that somehow I am an unimpeachable authority on all things war. I'm not. And neither is any veteran I know. A lot of vets I know have very interesting things to say and life experiences that can be very useful to engage with and talk about. And I think it's very useful, and we should be reading more vets and thinking more about some of the things that veterans have to say, but civilians should be doing that work too.
At your commencement, the day after your commissioning ceremony, I talked about your class starting at Dartmouth right after 9/11. And I talked about a night on the green when on September 12th, when I spoke to an assembled group out there. We're trying to figure out what to do and how to make sense of any of this. And I quoted from a Dartmouth person, Robert Frost. Frost wrote in Birch's, "I'd like to get away from Earth a while and then come back to it and begin over." And I said that while many of us would have been forgiven then for thinking that such a withdrawal from the world might have been a fine option, you, your class, never took that route. You know how much you can do. You have no limits. I simply want to know that you have learned about service to others, because we have observed the good works that you have done. And you did come out with a sense of enthusiasm and obligation and responsibility. How much of that does your millennial generation still have? What would you think now if somebody quoted to you about Robert Frost and about the need to make a difference? You're going to say, "No, we tried that."
I mean, I don't know about it's difficult to speak for my whole generation. I still feel optimistic, you know, as you know, and as much as I am concerned by some of the tendencies in the culture, I think that, you know, you look at history, you think we've been through worse things, we've gotten past worse things. I think that, you know, public attitudes are changing constantly. I do think people are amenable to persuasion. I still believe in service. I you know, still remain deeply proud of my time as a Marine. I do think that there are a lot of lessons that we have learned over the past 2 decades that, I think we need to change our institutions. We need to change some of the ways that we approach things. I think there's a lot of work to be done, but that sense of optimism is still there. My idealism with which I joined the military is certainly bruised in some respects, right? I think it was, I desperately wanted to believe that the kind of security gains that had happened in Anbar province when I was there during the surge and violence went down radically, desperately wanted to believe that was going to last, right? That, the people who I had met would not face more horror. And I cannot tell you what folks have been through over there is so unbelievably horrific. When I was in Iraq, I met a man in the center of Mosul, and his, the center of that city, I mean, it looked like I'd never seen anything like it, except maybe in photos of bombed out World War II cities. And he had been in sort of ISIS's last holdout as, sort of troops were moving in to take back the city of Mosul. And his children hadn't been to school for a year because, he was horrified by the sorts of things that ISIS was teaching them. Everything was, violent. The math problems would be like, bomb plus bomb equals 2 bombs, right? That kind of thing. And towards the end, they had no food. He said, we were eating cats, we were eating rats. To get water, they had to go to the river, but people would shoot at them. So it was a risky proposition. There were constantly bombs, airstrikes around the city that were killing tons of civilians. And he said his children were crying because they were hungry and he just wanted to protect them. And that experience, magnified by thousands upon thousands upon thousands, is the legacy of these wars, right? Things that happened, and those are things that just happened long after I got out of the military. So my idealism is bruised, and I think that's a good thing. But I at the same time, do not throw my hands up with pure cynicism. I don't think everything is broken. I think that most Americans are very good. Most of the service members that I worked with, were tremendous people. And I think also sort of just beyond the military, because I think that oftentimes when we talk about service to country, we hold up the military and forget how important those other aspects of service to country are. We sort of sanctify the veteran as a kind of priest of the American religion, when really, it's tremendously important to consider the hard work of nation building here at home. And so, yes, I think a retreat to pure cynicism would be in some ways easier. It would be the lazier route. But that idealism, in that sense that, if you join your shoulder to the wheel with other people, and try and in some ways make your world and your country a little bit better than it was before, that genuine things are possible, right? And so I think it's
a few years ago, you wrote a piece, and then I think it was a Jesuit publication.
Yes.
Where you were concerned. You acknowledged that you'd begun to question your commitment, your faith, and who you were. You worked through that in that essay, and I gather you're still have worked through that. Are you feeling more comfortable now that you know who you are and what you can hope to accomplish?
who really knows who they are? I think that's a lifelong process, right? Is it
And Ignatius
August?
did he?
Yeah. Augustine, soul doesn't find rest until it finds its rest in God. You might have, in your Catholic school education, encountered that one. So no, it's something that I'm still trying to work my way through, still trying to write about. I think that I do feel a real moral imperative to try and talk to people about these things and try and open up a conversation about them in a broader way, because they're issues of life and death. But I'm not hopeless. If I was hopeless, I wouldn't write. I wouldn't bother.
I hope you never become hopeless, and I surely hope you never stop writing. But I wrote something not too long ago where I do have confidence in this younger generation stepping up and making a difference. And we have 6 grandchildren. A couple of them are still in school, but none of them have become Marines, but 3 of them are or have been teachers. And that's very important to me. And I'm talking about teaching inner city. I'm talking about teaching and trying to make a difference. And I do have great confidence in this generation that they're going to make a difference, but they need a little more of a boost from us. And we have to find a way to do that, to encourage them.
It's always difficult when there's the stakes of the issue that you're looking at, the distance from the goal, right? That more perfect union and the difficulty of achieving it. But I have been inspired, and I think, even during this pandemic, right? The sort of kind of, there's the quietly heroic, steady work of first responders and essential workers throughout the country. There's the efforts of the protests, right? Where an unbelievable number of people came together to try and improve their country, right? To push the country towards more justice. I think that is, there are all sorts of reasons to hope, even as there are kind of sort of plenty of not just sort of difficult attitudes and ideas, but structures that need to be, I think, changed or dismantled.
Yeah, I want to return to service, which you had talked about, and I do think we need to. I am concerned. I share your concern that the military is becoming more of a family business. The generations join. I applaud them for it. I don't mean to be critical, but we shouldn't depend upon them to do that. And most parts of this country, people didn't really know anyone who was in Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you never have to worry about that knock on the door at night, you don't think so much about the war that's being fought in your name. And these wars are the first wars in American history where we haven't had a special tax to pay for them. And so your generation that fought there is going to pay off the debt from the wars that you fought. And I remember during the Korean War, people in Congress said we cannot at all accept the idea of these young men going off to fight this war and then coming back to pay for it. We have to pay for it ourselves now. But as we talk about more people serving, and one of the slippery slopes of aging is that you think of practical reasons why things shouldn't be tried or done, either because we tried that unsuccessfully in 1972 or something else. But I often hear people talk about some sort of mandatory service. And I look up periodically, and I did recently. Last year, I think there was something like 4 million Americans turned age 18, which would be the year where you'd think about, they would start to think about serving. And in my generation, that's when you went on the draft list, potentially. Of those 4 million, probably the figures are maybe 30% of them could pass a test to get into the military, either because of physical problems, issues with weight, education. It's a statistic that troubles me greatly, looking at that figure. But you've got maybe 1.2 million who could serve in the military. Right now, the military needs about 150,000 new bodies a year, men and women. Who should they be is the question. And some people suggest a lottery, and that might work. But I've talked to people who train, and based on my own knowledge of the Vietnam experience, they'd much rather have some young man who said I wanted to join the Marines rather than somebody say I was supposed to be starting school this fall at the University of New Hampshire, and what the hell am I doing here at Paris Island? And it's a difficult thing. And so you've got to figure out which ones are going to serve. But then the broader question of what about other forms of public service, which you mentioned, and I think that there's so much more public service than the military. The military is but a small fraction of it. I think we have to find ways to encourage that, maybe to enable it, maybe even to reward people for doing it. I don't think we're prepared at all to mandate it. We have trouble already monitoring things. Could you imagine if we have 4 million kids and somebody's got to monitor whether or not they have really performed public service and how well they served them? What would you do if they didn't do it very well or didn't do it at all? We just don't want to go there. But I think that we have to find a way in this country to return to something that John Kennedy said: ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. And I would expand that for more than country, your world, your fellow citizens on this world. What can you do for them? And I do think that there is a sense of idealism in this generation, a desire perhaps to serve and make a difference, but they need some guidance on how best to do that.
I absolutely agree. And like you, I'm skeptical of the idea of a military draft. I'm not sure what we would do with all those people if we did draft them within the military. And certainly, you know, in the military, you do want people who want to be there. You have enough trouble with the occasional knucklehead who joined up of their own free will. But I think that there should be a strong cultural bias in favor of service, and also a stronger respect for types of service that are not military. And a sense that, if you go out and you become a teacher, or, I know one veteran who told me he didn't feel like he'd actually come home until he spent some time in the parks department, literally digging trails, right? And one of the things about the idea of more opportunities and routes to public service for young people, which I think, whether we could mandate or not, I think we could certainly create more structures that could take people in and put them to use, for some period. I think that there's something important about, and broadening about, sort of being thrown together with a bunch of people from different walks of life, all sort of together working towards a common goal. And that was one of the tremendously valuable things about the military, that had in some ways nothing to do with war so much as, the Marine Corps was one of the places that I really met America, right? People from all walks of life and totally different attitudes and perspectives, and yet all bound together by a sense of common purpose, right? And that was a tremendously broadening thing. It gave me a better sense of my country and appreciation of the people within it. It prevents me from being as cynical about my countrymen as sometimes the news or social media sites would encourage you to be, because I know a lot of the people on the other side of the aisle in much greater depth than you get. And so I think it would be a tremendously good thing, yeah, to the very least have opened up more opportunities for people to do public service, to have more public recognition of the idea that public service is something important and patriotic and worthy of respect, even if it's not military service. I think that
Yeah.
would be a tremendously healthy
It
thing.
would be wonderful if thank you for your service could become an expression that would cover all forms of service, and
Yes.
not simply the
Yes.
military. I will always be among the first to thank those who have served in the military for their service, because I recognize what they have done and what they are doing, and they're volunteering, and they're trying to make a difference, and I have a tremendous respect for them. But there are other forms of service that we need to thank people for as well. I have to say, when I talk about thanking people for their service, and a service that's more than military service, although surely for that, I really want to thank you, Phil, Klay, for your service. As a Marine, as somebody who served in Iraq, somebody who's a teacher, somebody who is encouraging us to think again about some basic things about which we need to think again. I know Ken and Harlan Montgomery would be delighted to know that you're a Montgomery fellow this summer, and I'm just pleased to have had an opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. I am really thrilled to do the conversation with you as well, and I'll return that. Thank you also for your service as a Marine, and for your service to the Dartmouth community, for the work that you've done for veterans in the Dartmouth community, and also for your writing. It's been an honor to talk with you and to be a Montgomery Fellow, doing the virtual Montgomery Fellowship. This has been delightful, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you both, Jim and Phil, for going on this journey with us, making sure that everybody can hear me. And we're going to be bringing in a little bit people, Jim and Phil, for the live Q&A. By way of reminder, within this system, what you need to do is you need to submit your questions in the Q&A part of our webinar. I see that some of the participants have raised hands. We're not going to be calling on people who have raised their hands. So just go ahead and submit your question in the Q&A. As the moderator of this conversation, I'm going to take the prerogative of asking the first question. When we think of the military engaged in American culture right now, beyond the fact that we're not really talking about what's going on in Iraq or Afghanistan much right now. I guess we're looking at Germany and standing down troops. But obviously, we've been talking about the military as it relates to domestic issues. So a question that's simple to ask, but probably a lot more difficult to answer. What's wrong with having the military engaged in domestic strife? What do you gentlemen have to say about that?
Do you want me to kick that one off,
Please.
President Wright? Well, we are a country that from the very beginning, we're very skeptical of out-of-town troops coming and getting involved in local municipalities against the will of the citizens there, right? That's in the Bill of Rights. So one of the, there's a big difference between local law enforcement responding to issues at home, right? And the federal government coming in and responding against the will of the citizenry there. And so that is, I think, a concerning thing. And normally the military really doesn't like to do that. One of the points that Risa Brooks, who's an excellent scholar at Marquette on civil relations, will point out that even in authoritarian states, oftentimes the institutional military does not like to get involved in domestic repression. So I think that's one of the things that you saw when, sort of Donald Trump had this bizarre spectacle at Lafayette Square, and you had Milley sort of striding out in camouflage as though he was, walking onto a battlefield after peaceful protesters had been tear gassed to clear the square, so that the president could sort of handle a Bible with the grace with which my mother-in-law would handle a live lobster, and take a photo. And and then afterwards, Milley apologized. It provoked a response from a whole slate of sort of former military people. Famously, sort of Jim Mattis responded very forcefully. And then what we had was the federal government realizing, I think, that there would be a lot of pushback within the institutional military, and then using in Portland other federal forces in a way that seemed almost designed to further inflame tensions. And I think, part of this is about the norms of a democratic government, right? Which go, as I said, right back to our founding, that if a local government wants to handle things, does not want coercive, violent federal forces involved, there needs to be an incredibly high bar for us using them, because that strikes at the core of the basic norms of our democracy.
Jim, you want to take the question?
Sure, and I agree totally with Phil. It was a good history lesson, Phil. Thank you. And go back to the Boston Massacre. Go back to Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, and you'll know how this country was founded on the concern, the principle that the military not be used in domestic service. I think that there are circumstances perhaps where it would be necessary, but these are unusual circumstances. And in many ways, the military is best not used in that way for a very practical reason. They are not trained to maintain order on the streets, with the exception perhaps of some military police and other smaller units within the military. They're not trained for that. It's a lethal force. It's the most professional killing force in the world today. And they are not comfortable on the streets. They're not comfortable confronting fellow Americans. 43% of the military today are minority persons. They don't want to go out and to play this role. They'll do what they're told to do, as long as it doesn't run counter to their own moral principles, as they should. But this is not a place for the military, and I find it unfortunate. And it's not really a place for paramilitary units either. Actually, the military has been used not as often as other federal troops who are more posing as military. They're wearing camouflage gear. Now, it's not clear to me if I were designing uniforms, I'm not sure that the jungle or desert camouflage would be the sort of thing that I'd put on people to hide them in the streets of Portland. It's really meant to be intimidating, and I think it's most unfortunate.
Well, it seems to be designed to inflame tensions. I mean, if you wanted to handle protests, you wouldn't send the kind of units that were there, right? I mean, things have gotten worse in Portland since those troops were sent, which is why the sort of argument that you'll sometimes see in defense of the president's actions don't really make any sense. If it's really important that these things sort of die down or calm down, don't send units not trained to deal with that situation that will inevitably make things worse. And the suspicion, I think, for a lot of people is that things getting worse is kind of what the president wanted, because he wants the spectacle of the fight rather than actual order.
Well, okay, good. I have a question to follow up on that, but I'm looking at the questions that have already been submitted, and again, invite people to do that. I want to shift a little bit. And one question came in to ask about writing. And when you gentlemen write about war, to what degree is there an emotional investment in what you're writing? And to what degree is there an emotional detachment? And how do you play off those two things? When is it important to get emotionally involved in what you're writing? And when is it appropriate to step back and try and be 30,000 feet above it all? Jim, why don't you start with that one?
Yeah, again, I did not experience war. I have written about it, and it does have an emotional impact. I interviewed people in Vietnam, and I really sought out those who had served with those who were killed. I wanted to find about the experience on the ground, and I interviewed family members. And oftentimes I would come home at the end of the day after an interview or after some writing, and Susan would ask, "How did it go today?" And my best answer was, "It was okay." I did not want again to talk about talking to this young man who was weeping as he told me about picking up the body parts of his friend, and what that meant to him. There are parts of my book that I still get emotional reading, and I'm not writing to elicit emotion, I guess. On the other hand, if war and the true nature of war, what really happens in war, does not elicit emotions, we're in big trouble as a republic.
I think so. I often, I don't know necessarily how to answer that question, because they don't necessarily disentangle themselves from me so perfectly. I am deeply passionate about the things that I'm writing about. You need to have a certain kind of aggressive, analytic approach. Sometimes you need to be savage with yourself, but it's not a, you know, sort of going back and analyzing a piece of writing in terms of the mechanics of it. On the one hand, there's what Nathan Englander used to talk about, the Terminator screen sort of pops up, where you sort of analyzing every different aspect of the text. But the thing that is spurring me to put in the work is the kind of deep sort of passion and oftentimes rage that I have about these things, that kind of pushes me to find new forms and new methods of trying to reach out and talk about these issues. And so the end product for me, fiction particularly, feels like I'm being very raw and very exposed. It's this sort of strange time, because I have a book coming out in October, and it feels like you're about to expose a raw nerve to the world, and that's certainly how my first book felt.
And about your next book, Missionaries, I want to tell people that we'll have clips about missionaries.
Yeah.
And talked about that. A question came in about multiple deployments. And I want to frame it this way. How does being deployed change who you are? And how does being multiply deployed change the nature of the people who have to experience that? Phil, would you like to try that?
Well, it depends on the deployment, right? Some people have very different relationship to it, and also different types of missions can get people to feel very differently about it. I remember talking to one Special Forces veteran who talked about the difference between deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd been in Iraq in sort of a later period of the war, where when they were doing a raid, they would actually get like a warrant from an Iraqi judge. And so he said, even though in the popular consciousness at that point, Iraq was the bad war and Afghanistan was the good war, it felt more, it felt more just what he was doing, or sort of more directly related to a purpose that he could really believe in. Whereas in Afghanistan, he said, like, we were going out to the same valleys every year, and we weren't building roads or schools or any of that stuff. We didn't have money for that. we weren't even doing that much training. We were just doing interdiction mission after interdiction mission, getting into these gnarly firefights where the Taliban was sending these kids really to just get slaughtered by us. And, I sort of thought, why do they keep doing this? Until I realized, oh, they're doing it because they can. And he said the experience of that got very sort of, the kind of culture shifted in a way that became not necessarily nihilistic, but sort of more of a warrior culture, right? That felt disconnected from the types of aims and goals that theoretically the war was supposed to be about. And that really shifted the nature of people's experience and how they processed it. So, where you are, what type of deployment you are, what type of unit you're in is going to have a huge difference in terms of how you process those things over time. And if over time you're being continually sent out on missions where the sort of theoretical reason that you're abroad does not in any way match up with the day-to-day experience of what you're actually doing and what you're seeing on the ground, that's going to, people like to talk about sort of war trauma, but sort of beyond that, just sort of almost like sort of philosophically, how do you square that with who you are, what your purpose is, and what your mission is? It can get very, very strange. And so, that is I think very different from sort of somebody going on one deployment versus somebody going as part of a career, where they have to, continually grapple with these things.
So let me start with that. I mean, and kind of picking up on a theme that came through the conversation about service and different kinds of service and continual service. Jim, I'd like to give you this question. It says, do current events, the pandemic, the economy, unemployment, issues of equity in our society, does that make the idea of universal service more possible? And I'd like to stitch onto that the whole notion of, and maybe multiple deployments in different kinds of service. Jim, why don't you start with that question?
Yeah, I'm not sure that all of these crises and problems we're facing today should make military service more acceptable or more of a choice. It's not a practical choice. It's not. It shouldn't be something. Well, I want to get away from all this. I think I'll join. Although oftentimes people have joined for that reason. I do think that multiple deployments. In my experience in writing about and understanding Vietnam, of course, Vietnam had some multiple deployments, but very few, and generally they were professional life service people who wanted to go back again. Iraq and Afghanistan are quite different. We have really tried to fight these wars in many ways on the cheap. We've tried to keep the size of the force smaller. That means that we're sending more people over there. I think something like 70% of those who have served in the military over the last 15 years have been deployed to a combat zone, or even in World War II, it was probably only 40 some percent. We're needing to keep sending them over. And it does come at a real cost. I remember talking to one young man who had been the SEALs and had been deployed 6 or 7 times. And they were shorter deployments, but they were filled with a lot of emotion and terror and fear and anger. And he said he would just come flying back home. And then he told me that he was walking through a Walmart store one day and suddenly realized what he had been doing 48 hours before that. And he just started weeping and left his cart there and walked out of the store. I think it comes at a tremendous cost. When I went to the military hospitals, and I went down 30 some times over the years to visit the young men and women in the military hospitals, and I'd always ask them I would go to bed and ask about their experience. And I learned a lot about Iraq and Afghanistan through those conversations. I was struck, though, by how many people said, I'd like to go back, even if they're sitting there missing limbs. And there was no way they're likely ever to go back. They wanted to go. And my reaction when I first encountered this was, boy, they really have bought into the mission accomplished idea, but that had nothing to do with it. They wanted to go back because their friends were there again, and they wanted to be with their friends. I think there's a tremendous loyalty for friends, and when you see friends die, it comes at a tremendous cost. And I don't think we've begun to truly measure the cost that we've inflicted on Phil and his generation who have served there. It's a cost not just of casualties in the field, but it's a cost that some of them are going to endure for a lifetime.
Well, with that comment, I think, Phil, you get the last word. I think we're running out of time, but why don't you answer that? What is the cost your generation is paying, and how do you calculate it?
I think so there's a cost in terms of the percentage of Americans who serve, who are bearing the burden of going over and over again, but I think there's a broader societal cost. I think it is damaging to our democracy when we have such a degree of disengagement, when you have these sort of sprawling overseas commitments that happen sort of outside of real public purview. And I think that there are a variety of ways in which I think it is extremely important, as we're seeing, we talked earlier about sort of fears about certain types of democratic norms falling away, and having a sort of separate warrior caste. That is another sort of troublesome thing for a democracy. And so I think that as one of the things that my generation and younger generations, I think that the task that is before us is to find new ways of reinvigorating our sense of service and public life, not necessarily just in the military, because I don't think we're going to have universal service. I don't think we would know what to do with all these people if we had universal military service. So I do think we could radically expand opportunities for public service more generally. I think I wouldn't mind a broad program of hiring young people to take my kids out of the house and and care for them. As a father of 3 young kids, that would be high on my priority list of things we can do. But no, I think that there are a number of ways in which I think it's extremely important that we would sort of build back up the norms of our democracy and the institutions of our democracy and our sense of ownership of those. And I think that our utter disengagement from war, our extensive overseas deployments, and the sort of fraction of people who serve, that is one example of various ways in which we become alienated from the functions of our own government. And I think that is just one of several areas in which I think we need civic renewal.
Well, Jim and Phil, both of you, thank you for being a part of this conversation. Phil, thank you again for being our Montgomery Fellow
Thank you.
This summer. By way of reminder to all of you who are attending, this conversation, as well as other conversations, will be posted on the Montgomery website. You can go and see Phil's handsome face there and click on it and find out more about other conversations. They'll be rolling out over the next 10 days or so, and we'll be concluding this entire fellowship, this entire virtual residency with a roundtable with Phil and a number of vets. And so again, Phil, thank you for being a part of this. Jim, thank you for kicking off Phil's virtual residency. And all of you who have attended, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Likewise, thank you.
Bye now.